Okay, 1 sec. All right, so we are going to be covering training variables and training principles. You actually just got introduced to one of those training principles, which was specificity. Now, here are the training principles that I want you to be familiar with. They include adaptation, and actually I'm going to include a concept called accommodation. We have individualization, we have specificity, we have progressive overload, and then we also have variation. And I'll get into all the definitions of those as we continue to move on. And now, the training variables that I'm going to introduce, this is how we accomplish those training principles through the modification of these things, which include reps, sets, tempo, frequency, load, exercise selection, and rest periods. Now, a good way to think about this is that the exercises are the ingredients of the program. So what do we actually put into the program? And the variables are how much of that ingredient. And those two things together are going to make a good program. So if you said, I want to make a cake, and you put in salt and I don't know, what else would be a terrible idea to put into a cake? Salt, I'm drawing a blank, salt and corn, and then you put it in the oven and you're like, oh, this didn't turn out to be a good cake. Well, yeah, it's not going to be a good cake because you didn't put in the right ingredients. Similarly, if you said I'm going to make a cake and you have like flour, eggs, and butter, and you put in a spoonful of flour and a pound of butter and 15 eggs, that's not going to be a good cake either. So that's the how much. So when we're putting together a program, we need to think about those two things. What are we putting into it, and how much are we putting into it? Now, I consider there really to just be a few steps in programming. So one would be picking the right ingredients, which is what are the exercises? So how do we pick exercises? Exercises are picked, in my mind, in a hierarchy. So one is, the baseline is exercise preference. I say that because there's so many different exercises somebody can use to accomplish their goal, especially if we're talking about resistance training. The only instance where you're going to need to have someone do a specific exercise would be if they're training to compete. So like if they're training to compete in powerlifting, well, okay, you have to squat, you have to bench press, you have to deadlift. If you're going to do Olympic lifting, you have to do cleans, you have to do snatches. But if their general goal is I just want to improve my strength, I want to look better, let them pick what they like. Don't give somebody an exercise that they don't like. So that's number one. The next one is capabilities. So it doesn't matter if their goal is to get, let's say their goal is to gain muscle, and you think a back squat's a great exercise, and it might very well be for that person. But if they can't do it, then it's not a good exercise for them. So we need to regress in that case. So capabilities, that's the next thing that's going to determine exercise selection, and then also goals. Okay, so what do they like doing? What can they do? And then how do we match that to what their goals are? For the most part, if these things are equivalent, if capabilities and goals were equivalent, probably 80% of your program is going to be the same, regardless of who you're actually working with. But that is when we start building into another principle, which is called individualization. So we pick the right ingredients, so it means we pick the right exercises, and then we pick the right amount of that ingredient, and that can go hand in hand with what that person's goals actually are. So how do we pick the right ingredient? Well, we do something called a movement assessment. Okay, I won't do this just yet. So 1 sec. I don't know how great that video is going to come in. So here's a primer on a movement assessment, and this is something that we'll get into, as you know, because I uploaded the wrong lecture. And that's how do I pick the right exercises? How do I pick the right exercises for myself, or how do I pick the right exercises for the person that I'm working with? Now, if you've ever been to an optometrist, they have this contraption that they have you look in, and they They change the lens that's on there and they ask you if it's better or worse. That's all that coaching and an assessment is right now. Is you watch somebody move, you make some changes, and you decide if it's better or worse. If you can instantly improve it, you can stick with that exercise. If you can't instantly improve it, well, then we need to consider changing the exercise to make it better. So I don't know how good this video is going to come in, but this was a younger guy, and he was trying a goblet squat. And so we look at that, and we say, is this the exercise for him? So I don't know how well this is going to come in. But if you watch him do this, you're going to see clearly he's got errors. So this was not the exercise for him. So I look at that and I say, okay, we need to change this because at the current moment, that's non-ideal. There's different errors that are going on. You can see his hips are shifting. He's leaning forward a lot. Granted, he's a tall guy, tall kid. He was a kid then. So that might not be the right exercise for him right now. So we look at it. How can we make that better? That's literally all assessment is. So let's start out with training principles, and then we'll move into training variables. So anytime that you are training somebody, especially if, for example, if it's a novice, well, what do we want? We want positive adaptations. An adaptation just describes the adjustment of an organism to its environment. Now, this is not just a weight training thing. It's a law of nature that if an environment changes, the organism changes to better survive its new conditions. So with exercise, let's say the environment changes, there's new stresses placed upon the human body. And you as an organism need to change to better survive that stress. And that might mean your muscles get bigger. That might mean your aerobic capacity improves. So let me ask you this. What happens to a novice? So let's say you've never trained before, and you add weight to their routine, and they do, let's just say they start doing resistance training. What's going to happen to their body? Let's just say, and I mean more long-term physiological changes. Let's say they've been training for 12 weeks. What's going to happen to them? You can type it in. You can raise your hand and say it. What's going to happen to that novice? Gertie, that's correct. They're gonna, for the most part, they're gonna see some increases in muscle mass. All right, bonus points. Is that an anabolic or catabolic reaction? Gaining muscle mass. Imaginary bonus points. Five seconds for imaginary. Yes, it's an anabolic reaction. Maya, you get all the bonus points. Well done. Yes, correct. Anabolic reaction. Yep. Yep. All right. Really good. All right. So adaptation is those changes. Okay. Now, let's say this. How many of you raise your hand if you have been exercising for more than 5 years? Three? 3 years. You've been exercising for 3 years. All right. Which one of you who wants to volunteer? Kelly or Gertie? You guys can just type this in the text box. What was the difference between the gains that you observed from year 0 to the end of year 1 and then year 1 onwards? Did it increase, or did you see a plateau? Like, not a plateau, maybe that's not a diminishing rate of return. What did you see? Quick gains and then a diminishing rate of return? Not saying you aren't still getting returns, but no longer getting the newbie gains. Yeah, you get a somewhat diminishing rate of return. I mean, imagine if your goal was to get stronger. I think I had a base for lifting before I started doing deadlifting, but I think I ended up going from, I don't know, not being able to lift 315 to 500 within a year, and then throughout the next 7 years, it took me 7 years to gain another 100 pounds on it. I can't do that now, anyways. But there's going to be a diminishing rate of return. So another concept is accommodation. And what accommodation states is the response of a biological object to a constant stimulus decreases over time. So what does that mean? Let's say that you started lifting and you move your way up to bench pressing 135 pounds for 10 reps. What are you going to see? Well, you're going to see improvements in strength, and you're going to see increases in muscle size. Now, let's say that you keep doing the same exact thing for another year. You're not going to see notable changes to yourself because the stimulus is the same. If you want to cause adaptation and avoid accommodation, you need to change the stimulus. Okay? You have to change the stimulus, whether that means changing the exercise or whether that means perhaps progressively overloading the program, which we'll get into briefly. But if you keep doing the same thing, the response that you're going to see is going to decrease. So other than adaptation and accommodation, some very important programming principles are going to be overload, variation, specificity, and individualization. We'll start out with the principle of specificity, and this just means we get good at what we do. The principle of specificity states that training must be specific to the sport or activity, the type of fitness required, and particular muscle group. So how do we actually make training specific? Let me make sure I read this too. So the principle of specificity dictates that the adaptations of training will be specific to the demands the training puts on the body. So how do we make training specific? Well, one, we can make training specific with the use of specific energy systems, okay, which we just talked about. We can make training specific in terms of movement patterns, okay. So for example, if I wanted to get better at golf and I wanted my training in the gym to transfer over to that, I probably would want to work on rotational things. So maybe medicine ball tosses, side tosses. We can also think about in terms of, are we training for strength, endurance, or hypertrophy? So if, again, someone wants to get stronger, a rep range that's inappropriate for that person is probably something like 15. That's not appropriate for somebody that wants to improve their strength. They need lower rep ranges and heavier weight. So all of these athletes need similar, to some extent, similar things. If you look at the left side, the power lifter and the distance runner, those are going to be two totally different people. They're not going to train the same exact way. And as we get into needs of different sports, you will likely see some kind of crossover training, but not identical between things like a wrestler and a football player. Every single football player is probably going to have similar components to their training program, but depending on the position that they're playing, they're going to have probably some different demands or different things that they need to actually work on. This came in less well than I liked it to, but I showed you that image before where it was power, strength, and endurance. So if we look at something like a marathon runner, they fall all the way towards that endurance side. They really need to focus on training for endurance. A weightlifter, so someone that's doing Olympic weightlifting, they need to focus on fast force production. So they're not lifting, because they're moving things fast, They're not necessarily going to be focusing on entirely on absolute strength. And then wrestling, that's going to need some components of everything. You need to have strength, force, and also or speed, force, and endurance. I've forgotten her name, but she won the Boston Marathon about 2 years ago. But because of specificity, the exercises and training in various sports are going to be different. So, does anyone remember her name? Was it 2 years ago? 2018? Yeah, it's the last one that we actually had. But she's going to be training completely differently than somebody who's going for just like lifting weights. Okay, that's specificity. So again, we can accomplish specificity through a number of different ways: appropriate energy systems, appropriate training intensity, appropriate movement patterns. The next concept is individualization, and this principle on its broadest level just means fit exercises to people, don't fit people to exercises. So this was the basketball team that I trained before I moved to Boston. This was in upstate New York at State University of New York at Cortland. Now these are all basketball players, and they all have, in order to get good at basketball, there's specific aspects of training that will be different than different sports. That's the principle of specificity. But in terms of the principle of individualization, all of these people are basketball players, but they're all different people. So just because one exercise fits well for one person does not mean that it will fit well for everybody. Okay, so they're different. They have different segment lengths, maybe different injury history. So these are all things that I need to take into consideration. So individualization is everyone is different. Individualization can be done by analyzing which of these exercises and methods would best fit the individual's ability and training environment. With regards to the client or athlete's ability, one of the most common training mistakes involves trying to fit the individual to exercise instead of fitting the exercise to the individual. Some exercises just don't fit well in certain bodies. So if I look back at these guys and I think, all the tall guys are in the back, all the shorter guys, I actually am the shorter guy, they're in front. These guys on top, they have really long legs. That makes things like back squats a lot more challenging. Versus if you have short legs, it's going to be a little bit easier to actually do. So what's a better exercise to train their legs than doing something like a back squat? Individualization of training will optimize results and enhance the desired adaptation to the training protocol. The next principle is overload. And this is an important one. Now, the principle of progressive overload refers to the systematic modification of a training program over time. In addition to exercise intensity, progressive overload also refers to the frequency and increasing difficulty of exercise selection. So for example, that means advancing from low skill to high skill exercises. So that might look like moving from a goblet squat to a back squat or a front squat. In applying the principle of progressive overload to using specific exercise, strength and conditioning professionals should look for improvements in training volume. So what's training volume? Training volume is reps times sets times weight. We can improve training volume by also improving training intensity, so that means load. We can also improve movement quality. We can improve endurance and recovery. The principle of specificity dictates that overload methods chosen should be specific to the desired adaptation. So for example, if there's several ways to create overload, as in if I want to increase, I can increase repetitions, I can increase sets, I can increase load. If I'm working with someone whose goal is to improve their strength, the way that I probably want to actually provide them with an overload should be specific to that. So that might mean I want to increase the weight that they're lifting, and that's what I'll choose for my method of progressive overload. The next principle is variation. So the strength and conditioning professionals' programming objective is to create positive adaptations to the training program without reaching a point of accommodation where the client or athlete stops positively adapting or experiences a decrease in performance. And that was what we initially led off with. Due to the adaptive properties of the human body, the principle of progressive overload will only take the client or athlete so far. So what that means is I can't keep asking somebody or even myself to keep doing more and more weight, to be doing more and more reps. What I can do is I can change the exercise. So this is the principle of variation, is varying the exercises. So eventually a client or athlete will reach a plateau and be unable to keep progressively overloading the same exercise movements. This is why variation is important to consider after the principle of progressive overload. So if I am no longer seeing improvements on, let's say, a conventional deadlift, well, that's no reason for me to continue. I need to provide variation. So if I'm not improving anymore, I can change it over to something different, a different movement pattern. And we've talked a little bit about movement patterns, or a different variation within that movement pattern. So if I have a conventional deadlift and I want to change the movement pattern, maybe I'm doing a low bar trap bar deadlift next. If I'm plateaued out on a bench press, okay, well, let me change that exercise within the same movement pattern, provide some variation. So now maybe I'm doing a dumbbell press. Variation requires planned changes in exercise selection and training variables. This usually involves changing the exercises employed in the program and or modifying the order of the exercises. And as general guideline, changing the program every 3 to 5 weeks may provide the body enough time to adapt. And that might even be a bit much. So maybe you do the same exercise for I don't know, up to 6 weeks, and then swap it out. Okay. Real quick, type in this text box, what are the training principles that we just covered? What are their names? There were 6. 6 of them. So those are not training principles, Ragged. Those are what we're going to actually go over next. Those are variables. Maya, that's correct. Yeah, no worries. You're about to learn about all that. All right, great work. Okay. Now we'll talk about training variables. So every movement pattern is going to necessitate a specific exercise. So if my movement pattern is a horizontal push, I might pick a bench press as that exercise. Now, when we put that into a program, we need to consider reps, sets, rest periods, load, and then tempo. So let's say that I wanted somebody to do a bench press. That's my exercise. And if you look under the sets, reps, and load column, you'll see how many sets am I doing? What load am I prescribing to that person? That's where you see like 95 or the at symbol. So at 95, at 135, at 155, at 165 to 170. You'll see the number of repetitions that I'm doing. You'll also see rest periods. So sometimes that's kind of broad, which was as needed when I put down there. You'll also see the tempo. So in this case, it was 2, 0, 1. So what does that mean? That means that on the eccentric part, the down part, it's taking 2 seconds. There's no pause, the 0, in between the transition between the eccentric and concentric, and then a 1 second concentric. So basically it means we're trying to get that up fast. So every pattern has these components. So the programming variables are actually, it's the ingredients and then how much of the ingredients. So we have exercise selection, so that's what's going into the recipe or the program. How many reps are being completed, sets, load, tempo, rest period. Is there, in terms of exercise selection, is there a specific range of motion? What loading instrument am I using? Is it a barbell, dumbbell, kettlebell, sandbag, body weight? Then also biomechanics of the movement too. So if I say deadlift, there's different ways to do a deadlift. It could be more with legs bent. It could be like a Romanian deadlift. So those are all things to consider in terms of training variables. So if you're putting together a weekly program that's filled with all of these training variables, you're going to need to understand different training splits. So training splits just refers to how are we breaking the week up. And there's a couple different approaches that people use. One is a movement-based approach, where you're breaking down your program based on specific movements. And the other one is more of a muscle approach. So that's where someone might say, "What do you want to do in the gym today?" And they say, "Okay, I'm doing chest and buys." That's more of a movement-based approach. Another way that if somebody wanted to say, "I'm doing chest," another way that they might say that is, in terms of the movement approach, is, "I'm doing a horizontal pushing exercises today." Now, if we did a muscle approach, we might break our week down targeting specific muscle groups. So for example, if I wanted to train my quads on any given day, maybe I'm doing exercises like squats, lunges, or rear leg elevated squats. Might be doing leg press too, leg extensions. If I wanted to train my hamstrings, I might pick things like a Romanian deadlift or a Nordic hamstring curl. I might also do one of those machine hamstring curls. If I wanted to work my glutes, I might be doing hip bridges, deadlifts. Squats would probably work in that category too. If I wanted to train my back, I'd be doing things like pull-ups, lat pull-downs, and cable rows. Biceps would be any kind of curl variation. If I wanted to work my chest, I'd be doing things like chest bench presses, push-ups, incline presses, and cable flies. If I wanted to train my shoulders, I might be doing something like an overhead press or lateral raises. And triceps might be some kind of push down or kick back. Okay, so I don't even know if this is going to work. So you're going to tell me which one of these, I don't think I need to actually play the videos, I can tell you. So the left is going to be a pull-up, and then the right side is going to be a push-up. Which one is going to be training my chest? Left side or right side? Which one is training chest? Left side or right side? Just type it on in. All right, so the correct answer is that on the right side, I'm doing push-ups. So push-ups train the chest. Whereas pull-ups train the back. So the left side is a pull-up, right side is push-up. All right, I'm gonna move on to the next one. Okay, now that's more of a muscle approach, but what about a movement approach? I'm gonna just have you focus on movement group 2. These are different ways that I've seen people categorize movement together. So exercises are push. Push exercises are where you're pushing things away from you. So an example of that would be any kind of bench press. That's a horizontal push. If I'm putting things over my head, that's in the vertical direction. That's a vertical push. Okay, and then the next one is pull. I'm pulling things in towards me, or I'm pulling myself in towards something. So that could be like a lat pull down. That's a vertical pull because I'm pulling in the vertical direction. If I was doing a row, that's also a pull, and I'm pulling in the horizontal direction. Next is squat, so any kind of squat variation. Hinge is any kind of deadlift variation. And then you also have other categories like carry, So if I'm walking with weight, so that's ambulatory, I'm moving, I'm creating locomotion. Or also lunge. So basically anything single leg can fit into that category. Okay, so those are different movement categories. Now, when you look at this, same exact exercises, which one, let's start out with this. Which one is a pull exercise? Which one is a pull? The pull-up or the push-up? Go ahead, type it in. All right, great. All correct. Okay, now what kind of pull is it? Horizontal or vertical? Stupendous. Okay, so just by default, we know that the push-up is a push, right? What kind of push? Is it a horizontal push or a vertical push? Horizontal push or a vertical push? Which one is it? Horizontal or vertical push? All right, so the push-up is a horizontal push. You're pushing horizontally, so you're not putting something over your head or pulling something vertically in towards you. You're pushing it out in front of you, just as if my hands were pulling in with a row. A row, any kind of rowing motion, is going to be a horizontal pull. So you have these movement categories. So again, a movement category would be a squat, and that's an umbrella term for a bunch of different exercises. So just for that squat, there's lots of different variations. You can have a bodyweight squat, goblet squat, back squat, front squat, box squat, high bar squat, low bar squat, safety bar squat, Zerkshire squat. These are all different examples. And what you pick is going to be based on that person's skill level. So let me put this into presentation mode. So if I have somebody that is a beginner, I probably want to give them beginner squat variations. If I have someone that's an intermediate, I probably want to give them more intermediate exercises. Now, just because somebody can do a bodyweight squat correctly, which is a beginner exercise, does not mean that they can do a barbell back squat correctly. But the converse of that is different. It's that if someone can do an advanced variation like a barbell back squat correctly, they can most certainly do one of those beginner variations. So just think about that in terms of exercise selection. We need to make it based on that person's skill. And we're only going to gather that information from doing an assessment, which we'll eventually get into next class, actually, I think. So once we understand categories of training, we can start to talk about training splits. So how do we put our week together? How do we put our training week together? So different options are, one is whole body. Whole body would be where the training program includes movement on any day, includes movements from each category. An upper lower split just means one day I'm doing only upper body, the next day I'm doing only lower body, and then switching it around. Another more advanced training split would be maybe one day I'm doing vertical push and pull. That essentially means I'm doing overhead press stuff and I'm doing pull-up stuff or variations on that. Another day is squat, which is lower body but with a specific, more specific focus. And then maybe the next day I'm doing a horizontal push and pull. So maybe that's something more like bench press row. And then the last day would be something like a deadlift, which is more hinge categories. So maybe I'm doing conventional deadlifts, Romanian deadlifts, single leg deadlifts. So what I want you to do now in the text box, look at this. Let's just say somebody was only training on Monday and Thursday. These are the exercises that were selected for their program. And what I want you to do is I want you to tell me what training split you think this is. A, B, or C. Take a look and then type that in. A, B, or C. All right, pause, think more. The answer is not C. There we go. It's starting to get a little bit better. Yes, the correct answer is A. So why is the correct answer A? And I'm sorry, I probably should have said C is like day 1 is vertical push and pull, day 2 is squat. So I apologize for that. So it can't be upper and lower body because if we look at this, these exercises include upper and lower body in one day. So it can't be an upper and lower body split. This is a whole body split because look at day 1, goblet squat, lower body, TRX row, upper body, dumbbell lunge, lower body, lat pull down, upper, curl to overhead press, upper, Romanian deadlift, lower. And we have different movement categories too. Goblet squat, squat category, Romanian deadlift, hinge category. Okay? TRX row, horizontal row category. Curl to overhead press, vertical push category. So these include all the different movement categories in one day. Therefore, it's going to be full body or whole body. Okay, let's try this one. You have 1, 2, 3, 4 different days of training. You're gonna tell me what is it? Is this a whole body split, an upper lower split, or is it chest, quad, shoulders / glutes and hamstrings? So this one might get a little tricky. So really pay attention to it. There's kind of 2 correct answers, but I want the most specific one. Yep, the answer is going to be C. That's correct. So why is it C? Okay. So on day 1, Monday, we're training exclusively chest. On day 2, all of these exercises are geared towards training the quads. Day 3, these exercises are training our shoulders. And then day 4, really focusing on glutes and hamstrings. There's going to be a little bit of carryover. Deadlift does hit your quads a little bit. But for the most part, this is correct. Answer C. So again, just remember, different exercises fit into the same movement category. So here's what I want you to do. I'm going to give you a group example. or I'll give you like 5 minutes to work on each of these. And I'm trying to think of the best way to do this. But I want you to write this down. It's not going to be this part. I'll tell you when something will be submitted for actual work. I'm actually going to pause the recording at this point. But what I want you to do is I want you to give me 15 different bench press examples. And you might think, okay, this is going to be really, really hard. But a variation can be really, really easy. So for example, here's a quick one. You can change your grip on the bench press. So you have wide, you also have regular, and then you have close grip. That's already 3 different variations of the bench press. But then you can also think of range of motion, tempo, even rest periods and foot position. So I want 15 different bench press examples. Get creative where you're just using the barbell. Okay? So I'll give you 5 minutes. You can use the internet. Think of 15 different bench press examples.